The first question is, how did you discern a call into pastoral ministry? I mean, I think I know a little bit of your story just from your bio, but it sounds like an interesting call into pastoral ministry. Could you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah. Everybody's call is different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was a practicing lawyer, and I was on my way to my office in downtown Atlanta and was stuck in traffic on Interstate 75 South. And it was a Thursday, and I sensed the Lord tell me, He didn't speak out loud, but I sensed Him tell me very strongly in my heart, I want you to leave the practice of law and enter into full-time vocational ministry. I don't remember having thought a lot about that prior to that. It seemed to be, wasn't altogether out of the blue, and yet it was sort of out of the blue in this particular case. So I counseled with my wife, my pastor at that time, and my dad and my identical twin brother, who are wonderful Christians. And they all seemed to think that, and my mom, they all seemed to think that that really could be what the Lord was saying. And over time, He seemed to bear that out.
That was really your first, I mean, you'd had to have considered pastoral ministry at some point in your life, but that was really kind of the first time?
Yeah, actually I did. When I was an undergraduate, I told the Lord, I said, Lord, if you want me to go to seminary rather than law school, I'll do that. I'll be happy to do that. And the Lord got me a full scholarship to the University of Georgia Law School. And I thought, well, that's the Lord's answer. It's law school.
Yeah. Well, what was that transition like? I mean, what was that period like for you? Because I can imagine there had to be some challenges in there.
I was a full-time attorney, and they had a going-away luncheon for me on Friday. And the following Monday, I was an associate pastor at my church in Atlanta. It had doubled in size from 800 to 1,600 members because we had this wonderful pastor, and the Lord used his ministry tremendously. But obviously they needed another associate pastor. And he said, Steve, I think you should do this. Well, I had no seminary, no idea. I mean, talk about utterly clueless. I'm there Monday morning, and it's sort of, do you remember that movie, The Candidate with Robert Redford, where he runs for the Senate against this really established senator from California, and he wins, and the last scene of the movie is something, he's in the hotel room, everybody's celebrating this amazing victory, and he says something to the effect of, what in the world do I do now? Well, that was sort of the way it was.
Wow.
What in the world do I do now? But that pastor was good enough to take me under his wing and to train me.
Yeah. One of the things that we hear a lot about is we have, people come through quite frequently and talk about different trends, and it seems like, every 4 or 5 years there's sort of a new trend that blows through the church. Are there any trends that you see in the culture or in leadership, in church leadership, that you would say, man, that is really where I see things going over the next few years? I see this really impacting my congregation, or I see this really impacting how I'm leading, or this is a way that I'm feeling like I need to change some things because I'm seeing this shift or this trend.
That's a great question. It really does seem to me that the major cultural shift is postmodernity and everything that comes with that. I heard a few years ago, Josh McDowell, the youth speaker, spoke to a group of us at our denomination's annual meeting. And he said something very interesting. He said, 20 years ago, when I would speak on college campuses, I would say, Jesus Christ is the only way to salvation. And the answer of the college students would be, prove it. He said, today I speak on a college campus and say, Jesus Christ is the only way to salvation. And their response is, that is a bigoted and offensive statement. And so I think that's that one example, sort of in a nutshell, describes the creep of postmodernity more and more into the culture. And that's the culture that we deal with. About 8 years ago, the seminary had a conference called Evangelizing Postmoderns. I still think that's maybe the most needed conference that the seminary could put on, Evangelizing Postmoderns Part 2. In terms of pastoral ministry, a trend that sort of, that I have to say sort of concerns me is I think that there's real pressure on pastors, especially in suburban settings like this one, that the pastor should follow a sort of visionary CEO model. And I'm convinced myself that the biblical model is the model of shepherd. And I mean, that includes vision. Obviously, we have to lead. But there is real pressure, especially from congregations and settings in areas like this, that you're to be a visionary. You're to be sort of the CEO of the church. And if we don't watch out, that's going to take out of pastoral ministry a number of people who are very gifted for it, but who don't have CEO gifts. I don't have CEO gifts. Sometimes I despair that I'm not more visionary and wish I were like this pastor or this pastor. But I am who I am by the grace of God, right? Even with all the deficiencies.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you would consider to be the highest point of your pastoral ministry? Sort of, if you could describe maybe, and this was the point when it just seemed like everything was, it all sort of came together.
That hasn't come yet.
That's a great answer.
In brutal honesty, I'm not even sure it's all that close.
I love that answer.
Sorry to bring in another movie. If you've seen the movie Patton with George C. Scott, there's which I love that movie. There's a scene in which he's standing over the battlefield, and George Patton was 4-star general. I'm not sure he ever achieved 5-star, but one of the major generals in the movement of American forces through Europe into Germany in the spring and in the fall and in the spring of 1944 and 1945. And there's a scene in where Patton is standing over the battlefield with the bodies and the burned out shells of tanks, and he said, I do love it. God help me, I love it so. And when you stand and you preach the Word of God, you just think, God help me, I do love it. It's the greatest privilege in the world. Lou Gehrig said that he couldn't believe that the Yankees would pay him to play baseball because he loved it. And don't tell the congregation this, but I can't believe that I get paid to preach God's Word. I mean, it just astounds me. I get paid to study the Bible? I mean, this is highway robbery. They don't know this. I'd pay them if they'd allow me.
I'm sure they would.
I mean, it's just, I'm sure they would. The way the economy's going, I might wind up doing it too. But that's the high point. I mean, it's like I mentioned. Sitting at the end of Beth Reamer's hospital bed, and she knows she's dying, and she's got young kids and her husband, and she's 42, and that was just a moment when she said, I want my funeral to be about the glory of God, where I felt like, I should take my shoes off because I'm standing on holy ground. I really did.
Sure.
I told her that too. There are moments like that. To see somebody die is a sacred privilege beyond imagination. To walk with a mom whose son is just drowned into the emergency room to see the body is a privilege beyond your wildest imagination. To stand in that moment in the wedding ceremony where, somebody's singing the Lord's Prayer or they're lighting the unity candle and it's just you and that couple and you're the only one inside of their world in that moment. It's an unbelievable privilege. So many high points. But the high point, that would be heaven.
Yeah. Okay. What about low points? Because obviously, pastoral ministry is peaks and valleys, for sure. What about low points that you might feel comfortable sharing? Difficulties? There's
lots of those. There's lots of low points. The lowest was the Sunday, March the 17th, 96, when our youth pastor's wife called me and said, "Steve, you've got to come over and save our marriage," because she had just found him in bed with one of the teenagers. And over the course of the next few months, we found out not only was he guilty of sexual immorality, but guilty of sexual crimes. And he spent 4.5 years in the state penitentiary. And the weeks following that were very, very, very difficult. Very difficult. Helping the wife, helping the girls, trying with the Lord's help to hold the church together.
How is that situation? Is it? How is she? How's the wife?
I heard from her at Christmas, and she had a second marriage that also did not work out. And I contacted her back, and she didn't reply, and so I respected that. But I'm not sure she's recovered. They had a 1-year-old daughter, and his rights to see that daughter had been revoked by the courts until she's an adult and she can decide if she wants to see him. My sense is he's still not repentant even to this day. My best sense.
Well, you mentioned Jonathan Edwards already, and it sounds like he's had a pretty profound impact on your life. Who would be some other heroes that you would say are heroes of yours in pastoral ministry?
Heroes in pastoral ministry. Well, Edwards would probably be number one. And the reason is, in Jonathan Edwards, God combined this towering intellect. Historians, I think, will generally concede that Edwards and Franklin were the two most influential intellectuals in colonial America. But this huge brain with this heart that was so passionate for Jesus. I mean, just wow, how he sought the Lord all the time. I mean, it was not easy. The guy got fired by his church because he took the right position on the Lord's Supper. And wound up in the hinterlands as a missionary to the Indians. So he's one. John Piper is another. I know a lot of people are familiar with him. I find his writings to be enormously helpful, his sermons to be enormously helpful. My sermons are very different from his. I'm preaching. He preached through Romans in 12 years. I'm doing it now. It'll take a year and a half. But his sermons are enormously helpful. Tim Keller in Manhattan, the Presbyterian minister, is an enormously wonderful pastor. His new book, The Reason for God, just out in February. I read it. I commend it to everybody here. I mean, just read it, please. For the sake of your soul and for the sake of the people to whom you minister. Read The Reason for. It's an update of Mere Christianity, and it's just terrific piece of writing. So insightful, so helpful. He's one, the pastor I trained under is Jim Wood, who none of you have ever heard of. He now runs a ranch for children from troubled backgrounds in the mountains of Tennessee. I did all the legal work to get it established and was grateful for that. Jim, tremendous influence personally in my life. I would say those are the top three.
What is it about Jim Wood that you find so compelling?
When I graduated, I grew up Presbyterian, but when I graduated from law school, my older sister and her husband had started going to this Southern Baptist church, and so the Presbyterian church we were in had 8,000 members. It was so big we were sort of lost. So my parents started going, so I started going and ultimately joined. Then the summer after I graduated from law school, providentially, the Lord brought Jim there. And Jim had also grown up Presbyterian and had come from, of all places, he had planted a Southern Baptist church on Cape Cod that grew from 0 to 500 members. Cape Cod, Massachusetts, the People's Republic. That's what they call it, the People's Republic of Taxachusetts.
Yeah.
But the Lord brought him there. He was the first pastor I had ever sat in who preached expository sermons, just straight through books of the Bible. And it was like the Lord just opened up this window to truth and to the glory of God and to the beauty of God. It was like, wow, I didn't know all this was here. And it just, all I can say is it set my heart on fire. And I'll be eternally grateful to Jim for that. Not that I had sat under bad preaching, but I mean, it was different. And it was straight from the Bible. But it was intelligent and it was applicational and it was just glorious.
Well, one more question, and then we'll open it up and allow people to ask questions. There are obviously a room full of people in training for ministry in the church, counseling ministry, ministry and academics. What sort of advice would you have to them? What sort of word would you hope to leave with them?
Since I am a graduate of Trinity, maybe I'm in a decent position to give some counsel. Take advantage of all the opportunities that are available here. You know, take Doug Sweeney's class on Jonathan Edwards. Just, okay? I hope you realize that when you graduate from here, you will have behind you, by the grace of God, one of the finest seminary experiences that anybody can have in the world. Do we realize that? I know as students, we used to do this in law school. I mean, we complain all the time. It's too much work. This guy is so boring, and whatever. Seize the opportunities that the Lord gives you here. This is a remarkable place, and the Lord's given you a remarkable blessing to be able to be here. So just take the fullest advantage possible of the opportunities the Lord has set forth. I mean, you will be learning Greek and Hebrew from some of the finest Greek and Hebrew scholars on the planet. Just work hard. I know it's hard. I know you think I cannot parse another verb or decline another noun, or I will throw up. In that moment, just pray, God help me, and He'll give you the grace. He'll give you the grace. That's not all that helpful, maybe, but I hope it is.
Yeah.
I hope it is.
I imagine it's very helpful. Okay, let's open it up. We've got time for a few questions. And then, would you mind repeating the question when you hear it?
So it gets recorded.
Oh, yeah. Okay. We've got a microphone. So if you've got a question, just raise your hand. And anyone?
How large is your church now?
how large is our congregation? It's a little more than 400 members, and attendance on Sunday morning and 2 services in the school year will be between 400 and 500, in the summer less.
You mentioned previously that, concerning the CEO model of, you talked about the detriment of the CEO model of pastoral ministry, and I've seen that sort of taken into other venues, and it doesn't really work very well. But at the same time, how is it possible for a pastor to be a shepherd of a congregation of, let's say, 2,000, and everybody's expecting the pastor to be there, from the cradle to the grave for each individual life? What are some solutions to that? I mean, to keep that personal touch in ministry that is so, I think, vital to pastoral ministry, but yet on such a broad scale.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I really don't know the answer because I've never served as senior pastor in a church of 2,000, but my observation is that senior pastors in those sorts of circumstances do 2 things. Number one, they do have to narrow the scope of their ministry. They can't do all the hospital visitation anymore, and they can't do all the counseling, and they can't do all the meetings. Thank the Lord for that anymore. And then you bring on additional staff in the form of associate pastors who are able to do those things. Strategically, how you do that is really a matter of prayer and really discerning the Lord's will in those areas. But I have heard pastors of larger churches say that they really feel it dangerous when they get to the point where they just don't have time to do any counseling, and they don't have time to meet with any sort of real people who have real problems, because then they feel like the danger is your preaching is not real because you don't know where people are anymore. So even when you become a pastor of a large church, you've got to be able to carve out time to do a little bit of counseling and a couple of weddings every year and some funerals, and not just of the chairman of elders, but other funerals, so that you're in contact with real people with real problems, because that keeps your preaching fresh. Otherwise, it's not going to hit people where they really are, I don't think. That's the risk, potentially. That's the risk.
Yeah. Jason.
You mentioned in chapel that you meet weekly or every other week to pray with local pastors. Does your church link with those other pastors like in an organization like Catalyst or anything, or do you do any co-church things with those pastors?
Yeah, we're involved in Catalyst for one, and with the pastors group with whom I pray, our churches meet together twice a year for prayer on 2 specific events. One is the National Day of Prayer, the first Thursday in May, and then in November we also meet together for the Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. And we just move it. We'll have it at one of the churches, and we just move it from church to church, so everybody gets a turn for it to be really convenient for them. And I'll tell you, those events are incredible blessings. The National Day of Prayer is coming up. We had the Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church at our building this past November. And it's just, we tell people, pray with people you don't know. Get in a small group and pray with people from other churches. And it's really amazing.
This is a good point to remind everyone that tomorrow is our day of prayer. I'm always just trying to, plug that. So, okay, next question.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It's kind of back to the CEO model and the size of your church, and you sit in the shadow of a mega church. And statistically, most of us will never pastor a church of 2,000. It'll be a church of 200 or less, or maybe a little bit more. And I'm wondering about managing that, how you find your niche for ministry in the light of some of these other larger churches, and maybe how that impacts your people and their thinking, or sometimes looking down the road and seeing something larger, or watching somebody on TV and you don't preach like them. Those kind of pressures that can be on a pastor today.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. The first thing you have to do, and I still need help in this area because the Lord hasn't sanctified me fully, is to ask the Lord to guard your heart from jealousy of the larger ministries. Honestly, when we pastors get together, and I mean pastors of churches of more moderate size, it's easy for us to critique the pastors of the larger churches. Well, he's an idiot in this area or something like that. So we really do need the Lord to guard our hearts from jealousy. It's easy to lapse into that. Having said that, how do you find out what it is the Lord wants your particular church to do? Every local church has a bit of a different flavor, and it does seem that the Lord has a particular call on each local church. And so consequently, find out what that is for you as the Lord would lead you, and then by His grace be the best at that you can possibly be, realizing you don't have to be the best at everything. Is that a decent answer?
Yeah, I have a question, Pastor
Mark?
Steve.
Yeah.
How far out ahead do you map out your preaching schedule, and how do you, I guess not balance, but how do you work like Old Testament books versus New Testament books? Do you think through that, or?
The answer to this is embarrassing. I think my sermon's out 1 week in advance. I would not recommend that for anybody. I say that, do I have some general sense? Yeah. And sometimes, like I do have the whole month of April mapped out because it's a special series. I do try to balance. Ordinarily, I preach through books of the Bible. Not always. Again, in April, we have a special sort of series, and the sermons will still be expository, but they won't be through the book of the Bible that I'm currently preaching in. Summer, I generally will preach something else too. I do try to balance Old and New Testament. I don't do that as well probably as I should. On Wednesday nights we have a prayer meeting and I lead a Bible study. And if I'm in the New Testament on Sunday mornings, almost always on Wednesday. We're in the New Testament on Sunday mornings. We're in Amos on Wednesday evenings. So I do try to balance it well. Dr. McGarry has challenged me a bit on that, though, through the years. So I did Leviticus in the fall, though. So.
Yes.
I was just wondering, the sixth point that you were talking about how to glorify God was seeking Him as the treasure of our soul, like above all else. And I was just wondering, once you get in the grind of seminary and in the grind of ministry as well, how you keep that up. Because that is kind of the most important thing that we can do.
Yeah.
So.
What means do you avail yourself of? What means of grace do you use to keep your soul fresh toward the Lord? This is not going to sound like a real insightful answer. The daily reading of the Word, devotional reading, as opposed to, I have to preach. So I study, the Greek, the Hebrew, I do that for a passage I preach on, but then to read devotionally, I had a friend who recommended, when you read devotionally, ask the Lord before you come to your passage, give me one verse out of this reading this morning or this evening that you really want for my soul? And then what you do is you take that verse and you begin to pray based on that verse. So it really gets in there. And you roll it over in your mind during the day. And that's a really good way to meditate on that particular verse. So that helps me a lot. Prayer, one thing about 10 years ago when my wife got pregnant with our third child, I started jogging in the early mornings, and that's been enormously good for me because up until that time my prayer life was sort of hit and miss, in all honesty. And now I've got that 45 minutes every morning, and I don't put the iPod in. I don't even have an iPod. It's too expensive. My kids have iPods. So I don't put the iPod in, and I pray. So that's what I do when I run. And it's particularly good if you can get in that habit because, of course, running stimulates the endorphins in your mind. So your mind becomes unusually sharp. And it's a little bit easier to focus. I mean, it's actually easier for me when I'm running, even though I run through a forest preserve and see deer, and it's beautiful. Dr. Manich, I see him. He'll be running one way across the bridge, and I'll be running the other way on a lot of mornings. So that also helps me. That keeps my soul fresh. Now that means for women that's a little harder because I can run alone, and so it's easier for me. For a woman, that's obviously harder. But that really does tend to, prayer, Bible reading, fellowship with other believers, reading good Christian books helps too. The Timothy Keller book was really helpful to my soul. Our family, before we put the kids to bed at night, we read the Bible and we pray together. And I ask the kids questions. I have a little 4-year-old boy, and I'll give him multiple choice. Okay, John, here's the question. Last night we just started Matthew, and it was the genealogy. And I said, John, did we read the genealogy of Mommy or Jesus tonight? He got it right. And I had explained what a genealogy is, by the way. So, and those are sweet times. When I was little, my parents, you just thank the Lord. I hope you had Christian parents. If you didn't, I'm sorry. I really am. My parents, we prayed together, and we sort of had prayer assignments. And mine was every night as a child, I would pray for an end to the war in Vietnam. And that is that's really powerful. To remember that through the years. As a 9-year-old, praying for, Lord, please end the war in Vietnam and please bring our troops back home. So, those are some of the things I do and read Jonathan Edwards. I mean, don't start in the heart. Don't start with the nature of true virtue. Start with his personal narrative of his life. Start with the revival accounts. George Marsden's biography of Jonathan Edwards is like, it's some of the most wonderful devotional reading. Read Pilgrim's Progress, for goodness sakes. Yeah, that's rambling. Is that helpful at all? Okay, sorry. Tend to ramble.
No.
I'm a lawyer.
Other questions?
Pastor?
What is the most important thing you do and the least important thing you do?
The most important thing I do in ministry and the least important thing I do. The most important thing is on a week in and week out basis is preach the word in season and out of season for a lot of different reasons. But that's week in and week out. That's the most important thing. The least important thing. This morning the power went off. We have a big ladies' Bible study, so I called the church administrator, and he led me through turning the circuit breaker back on. That might be the least important, just because it's fresh in my mind. Yeah, I was really terrified. I mean, this panel is, I told the ladies, I said, 2 things: pray for me, and if you hear an explosion, call 911 immediately. But with the Lord's grace, I got the thing on. The most maladroit person, handyman in the world, got the electricity back on in the church.
Now, you don't advertise it as the big ladies' Bible study, do you?
We better watch our adjectives.
Yeah, watch
right?
the way you describe that. I think that might get you in
It's the
trouble.
community. It's Bible study fellowships. It's about 300 ladies.
That's good.
That's
yeah.
what I mean.
Yeah.
Large
Yeah.
in number. They're,
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
wonderful ladies.
Yeah.
Not a single one of them is large in stature. Not a one.
Pastor, what do you see as the role of denominational affiliation for pastors and for churches? Because you mentioned Presbyterian and now Southern Baptist. What's your take on that?
Yeah. By the way, you know what the definition of a Presbyterian is, don't you? In the South, it's a Baptist who's gone uptown. That is strictly the Lord's will in your particular circumstances. It's funny. I remember my parents joined the Southern Baptist Church, and being Presbyterian at the time, I said, Mom and Dad, that's fine for you, but don't ever expect me to darken the doors of a Southern Baptist church. And I think I heard this sort of cosmic laughter about 1 million miles away. And the Lord had other plans. So I'm grateful to be a pastor in the Southern Baptist Convention for a lot of reasons. Our denomination is far from perfect. But I will say this. Doug Sweeney wrote in his book on the history of evangelicalism that our International Mission Board, you use the word, sets the gold standard. And that's a direct quote in missions. And I am grateful to be a Southern Baptist because Southern Baptists do believe in the cause of world missions, and their money, where they put their money, shows it. I mean, we have a Christmas offering for world missions and surpassed the goal this year of $175 million. Okay, so I am grateful for a lot of reasons to be a Southern Baptist, but we have not cornered the market on wisdom, and I go to the annual meeting, and sometimes you can be extremely frustrated. And being from the Midwest, I mean, I'm from the South originally, but I grew up in the suburbs. The place I grew up looks just like this. And so some of the sort of rural Southern themes that run through the Southern Baptist Convention are just as much, I don't get them, as much as the guy from Brooklyn. So, yeah, it's not perfect, but by the grace of God, it's a good place to be. But that is strictly between you and the Lord.
Steve, you talked about this a little bit already, but what are some of the things that you're intentional about doing that have to do with making sure that the busyness of pastoral ministry doesn't do damage to your marriage and your relationship with your kids? Are there things you set out to do in a very intentional way to kind of protect your home life?
Yeah, there are. For example, Friday is my day off, and the office is instructed that they're never to say, oh, Pastor Steve's at home, you can call him there, unless it's really an emergency. The other thing is, Doug, is we have wonderful elders in our church, and they really are very sharp-eyed for just that sort of thing. That's if you can get elders in your church who will look out for your best interests, that is an amazing gift from God. And for example, in my annual review, which was last month, they said, we want you to take an extended vacation this summer. We notice you've been working a lot of extra hours. and lately, and so we want you to take the whole month of July off. Thanks be to God, I have a brother who's a wonderful Christian who earns a good income, and he's given us an amount that we can take a real decent vacation as a consequence. So they look out for that too, Doug, and that's an enormous blessing. But you do have to draw lines, and you do have to say to people, please don't call me at home anymore, unless it's an emergency.
How does your law background play into your pastoral ministry? How do you see the skills develop?
That's a really interesting question, Owen. And I've thought about that a lot. And the one really obvious thing is you would be amazed at how similar preparing a sermon is to preparing an argument in court. And I don't mean an argument related to a trial. I mean an argument related to a motion of some kind, a procedural motion of some sort. Because, when you prepare a sermon, you're exegeting a passage of Scripture, and you use helps to do that. Commentaries, Bible dictionaries, grammars, and so forth. When you're preparing an argument in court, you are exegeting either a statute or a principle of the common law. And you have helps to do that. Namely, the court decisions in your particular state for the last 200 years. It really is an amazingly, you're just trying to interpret language. And so in that sense, the Lord, I know, did not waste the 3 years of law school. In that one respect especially. And people in the church appreciate that I was, I worked in I was out in the real world, as if pastors never in the real world. But they do seem to appreciate that. They think I sort of have a leg up on the concept he can relate to me because he knows what it's like to be out there. So those two things I'd say. It's a great question.
I think we've got time for one more question. One more question?
Yeah, I'll ask it if nobody else will. You had mentioned earlier kind of the hardest time in your ministry was when your youth pastor was involved in all of that sin and crime and stuff. And I was wondering if there were any things that you and the church learned from that situation, any just advice you have for people who may be leading staffs in the future on kind of parameters or accountability that you guys have set in place since then.
Yeah. Do you know we had all that in place before that? I mean, we had the rules about how the male staff members are supposed to deal with females. And as far as anybody could tell, he was obeying the rules. We had the accountability in place. We had done the reference checks with respect to his background in terms of sexual immorality. And he was hiding this from his own wife. And thus he successfully hid it from us as well. Now, the one thing we have added, and since then your insurance company will require it anyway at this point, is an FBI background check. But that's not going to catch very much. I mean, if he's forged checks or something like that, it will catch that. But it won't catch sexual immorality. The devastating thing was one of the pastors from whom I had asked a reference for him knew about some of his sexual immorality and chose not to tell me. And he told me later, he said, I just thought he was over it and deserved another chance. Yeah, and that was really one of the devastating parts of this. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for asking.
And, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And thank all of you so much for coming, and we'll see you again on Thursday. Pastor Lee Eckloff.